Tonight's episode of Man to Man is dedicated in the memory of our friend Anand, a wonderful human, a highly talented musician, and an incredible soul. Hello, one and all, and welcome to this latest installment of Man to Man. I am your host, Jon Phipps, and as always, I am so grateful to be doing this for all of you. Special shout out to the guest on Man to Man last time, Kyle Boone, college basketball writer for CBS. He was a fantastic interview, and I got a lot of positive feedback about that interview. And I feel I'm going to have another great turnout and another great round of positive response for this guest on Man to Man this time around. So it's not often that I get to interview somebody who shares the love of racing like I do. And not only that, this individual that I have on the show today also shares a love of the written word and has the gift of gab and has been at it for a long, long time. And I'm over the moon to have this gentleman on the show today. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage here, the screen, Mr. Rick Houston. Hello, sir.
Hey man, how are you? You talked about racing and then said that you were over the moon. I see what you did there. I see what you did.
Yes.
How long did
So
you work on that?
I did. Honestly, I just came up with it off the top of my dome.
Okay, all right, I got you. I
Top of my
got you.
dome. So, Rick, we'll start at the top of everything here. Where in this wide world of ours were you born?
I was born on Redstone Arsenal, the Army base in Huntsville, Alabama. My dad was in the Army when I was born, and I was actually 6 years old before I spent two birthdays in the same state.
Wow.
The longest period of time that we spent anywhere was in Japan. We went to Japan right after my first birthday. I spent my second birthday in Japan, and then I came home. We were actually on the plane home from Japan on my third birthday,
Wow.
or at least that's the story that I've been told. And my mom and I came home from Japan while my dad went to Vietnam. So we got to go to a much better location than he did. So yeah, that's all I knew growing up was my dad being in the Army and moving. And then when he got out of the Army after Vietnam, we settled in Nashville, Tennessee, and I lived there uh, for the rest of my youth and on into adulthood, with the exception of a couple of years. My dad took a job back in Huntsville for a couple of years, but after that we moved right back to Nashville.
Wow. So talk a little bit about that. Just moving around all of the time. I know I have friends who are military brats, they move around a lot. How did that moving around impact you?
It really didn't because I was so young. I don't remember it.
Okay.
My earliest, I can remember snatches, just very brief snapshots of when I was when we were in Japan, but nothing sustained. My first sustained memories took place when we were back in Nashville, in Tennessee.
All right. So my second and third questions here on the list, I guess I could kind of just have them one after the other. How did you first get into journalism? And when and how did you first take a love of racing?
I got into journalism at during I guess my first year on the newspaper staff was in the eighth grade there in Tennessee, there in Nashville, and I was on the newspaper staff all the way through high school. My senior year in high school, the newspaper that I was working on at the time, the high school newspaper, we were ranked one of the best 5 newspapers, high school newspapers in the state of Tennessee. That was a big thing for me. And honestly, I've wished many, many times that that I had majored in journalism in college. I think my road would have been a little bit easier if I had.
Mhm.
But in about my sophomore year, I felt like I was being called into the ministry, and I actually graduated from college with a degree in religion. And
Wow.
the sum total of my formal training in college, I took one basic journalism class towards the end of my time in college, and then everything else, the rest of my experience was on the job training.
Wow.
Yeah. So I did get my degree, but it's in religion. So live and learn, baby.
So when did the love of racing first get seeded?
uh, I grew up a huge baseball fan. I mean, I worshipped baseball players. I memorized the fronts and the backs of baseball cards from probably beginning in 1970, 1975 throughout like throughout 1985, 1986. And I was, I loved baseball. I loved baseball players, but I worshiped the Cincinnati Reds of the Big Red Machine era and Pete Rose in particular. My favorite baseball player of all time to this day remains Pete Rose.
Wow.
However, we know what happened to him.
Yep. Yeah, we
And
do.
so I needed to go in search of another hero. I needed to go in search of another hobby. And 1989, I went over to my best friend's house from high school, went over to his house, and he and his mom, or he and his family, just happened to be watching the 1989 Daytona 500. And at that time, watching that race or watching a race, any race at their house was an event. I mean, they put on a picnic spread for every race. It was honestly like a Super Bowl party every week. And so I was intrigued by their passion for the sport. I was intrigued by their responses to the different drivers. Everybody pulled for a different driver, if for no other reason than to have something to fuss about. And so I just became a NASCAR fan that day. And Darrell Waltrip won, so he was from there in Middle Tennessee, so that was a big deal. That was a big deal to me. He was a man of faith, and I was a man of faith, so that was a cool connection. But also, he had the best looking race car
Yes.
on the racetrack. That bright day glow orange
Mhm.
Tide car was awesome. I mean, you couldn't miss it on the track. And so I became a Darrell Waltrip fan. I became a Richard Petty. If you follow NASCAR at all, you have to be a Richard Petty fan. That's just a given. I mean, I, so Richard Petty, Darrell Waltrip, Harry Gant, those were my heroes. Well, that day Um, as I started going to their house every Sunday to watch races, the family subscribed to this newspaper called, I want to say at that time it was still Grand National Scene. And in 1989, the name of the paper actually changed, I believe, in August. So it for sure it was Grand National Scene when I started, and I picked that publication up, that newspaper up every week. I thumbed through it and I started reading it, and because it was so detailed and so in depth, and I wanted to be a journalist anyway, I felt like I was going. I felt like I wanted to write for Winston Cup Scene.
Mm.
Well,
Which
it,
roles? Go
in
ahead.
in NASCAR at that time, writing for Winston Cup Scene was essentially like writing for the New York Times. And so I started begging and pleading and cajoling and whatever with the people who ran Winston Cup Scene, Steve Wade, Deb Williams. And that was 1989. I finally had my first story published in Winston Cup Scene in 1992. So it for about 3 years, they put me off.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that rolls perfectly into my next question, though you already answered it to a degree there. How did you first get into working with NASCAR Scene? I know you have just a incredible story about how you worked your way up to
Yeah.
working for the scene.
Um, I first contacted Deb and Steve 1989. Told them that I, was wanting to be a journalist. Well, everybody wants to be a NASCAR journalist, and so I'm sure that they had many people like me talk to them and contact them. My first wife decided that she no longer wanted to be married, and she asked for or demanded a divorce in late July of 1990. And the last thing that she said to me before I got in the car to leave was that I would never be good enough to write for Winston Cup Scene.
Oh God.
And for quite a while, I believed her. But I moved. Well, I got my first job in racing or racing publication in 1991. Moved to North Carolina. It went bankrupt. Moved back to Nashville. Got another gig with a fly by night racing newspaper. Moved to Virginia Beach, Virginia. Stayed there for about I think I was there maybe a month, 2 months, and they ran out of money, so I was right back in Nashville. And finally, at the end of late September, early October, well, late September of '92, I moved to North Carolina for good. I went to cover a race at Martinsville and snuck food out of the press box and slept in my car. I got to North Wilkesboro. I got to North Wilkesboro the next week and planned to do the same thing. I was going to sleep in my car and sneak food out of the press box, but I got there Friday morning and I found out that they didn't serve food until Sunday. And so the next 2 or 3 days were pretty. That was rock bottom. That was absolute rock bottom. However, that weekend, Deb Williams told me that my very first story was going to be published in Winston Cup Scene the next week. And so that kind of opened the door. In 1993, I did I don't know, a handful of stories for him. But 1994, at the beginning of 1994, I was put on retainer at Winston Cup Scene.
Wow.
And that meant that I was responsible for a couple of features a week or a month. And finally, I was hired full time as a full time staff writer, and started on November 1st, 1994. And
And
my first day on the job at Winston Cup Scene, I made sure that a subscription was sent to my ex-wife's house.
there you go.
How
There
do
you
you
go.
like me now?
Slam dunk right there. You mentioned earlier Richard Petty and your first story in NASCAR Scene. I believe it was about Richard Petty's longtime gas man Robert Calicut.
He hadn't been the gas man for very long. He had actually just started at the beginning of 1989
Oh,
as the
okay.
gas man. He had served, I think, the year before as the catch can man,
Oh,
but
okay.
he moved up to the gas position in 1989, and at Atlanta early that spring. I think it was maybe the fourth or fifth race of the year. He was gassing the car when it backfired and caught on fire, and he was pretty severely burned. He had second and third degree burns over, I think, 33% of his body. But I actually met he and his wife at the first Cup race I ever attended, and kind of built a relationship and knew him, and that was my first story for Winston Cup Scene.
Talk about your time with the scene. I know you were with them for how many years?
I was actually with Scene for 9 years, and then worked as the PR person for the Busch Series. I actually worked for NASCAR as the PR person for the Busch Series.
Mm. And so you tell a little bit about what a typical work week would be like in the terms of scene, and also tell some of the stories about working for scene.
A typical work week, um, we would leave for a race on Thursday, typically, and we would be at the racetrack Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And depending on what the location was, we would either drive back Sunday night or Monday morning. And Monday, we would drive back. If we traveled on the weekends, we got Tuesdays off, and then we would do it all over again starting Thursday. So it was a pretty crazy work week. On off weekends, on off weeks, feature stories were always due on Thursday, in order to give the production staff time to lay it out on Friday, and then all our race copy was due on Sundays before we left the racetrack. And my biggest claim to fame at Scene was that I was the Busch Series editor. So that meant that most of my races were on Saturday. And so what I would do, and this sounds so ghoulish or whatever, but I would actually file a short story before I left the racetrack. I called that my death copy. And that way, if something happened between the end of the race on Saturday and Monday, they would have something to go on. But
Mhm.
I always, of course, I made it. I somehow made it through, and fleshed that story out on Sunday before the Cup race, and just filed it like that. So, but as for stories, there's no way that I could single out any one story. I mean, the owners that I knew, the drivers that I knew, the rivalries that I sometimes found myself in the middle of,
Uh,
uh, it was kind of crazy. It was kind of
mm.
crazy.
Let's pivot then towards some of those characters that you dealt with, because you were covering the Bush series in what I feel like is the golden age
Oh
of the
yeah,
Bush series. You had Tony Stewart in the series. You had Dale Earnhardt Jr. in the series. You had Matt Kenseth in the series. And just so many, aside from the drivers, just so many great personalities as owners. You know,
well that's
Bob Labonte, James Finch,
yeah,
guys like that.
and that's
And
that's
do you
kind
have a
of that
favorite of them?
that's kind of my thing about the Bush series. You named guys who were in the Bush series who went on to be Cup stars,
Mhm.
and some of my favorite people in the sport were drivers and personnel who never made that big an impact on the Cup Series. Jason Keller is one of the he's one of the nicest people you would ever meet. Glenn Allen, Buckshot Jones, Randy LaJoy. You can just go down the list. Bill Baumgardner was a team owner. He was the first team owner to field three straight Busch Series championship teams. And so it was truly fertile ground for stories. I mean, I could go into any holler up and down that garage and be able to make a connection with somebody.
And talking about tracks as well, the Busch Series back then was very eclectic in where they went.
Yeah.
Did you have a particular favorite track to cover a race at?
I didn't necessarily have, well, Bristol. Bristol is my all-time favorite racetrack. The view from the Bristol press box is what I imagine the view from heaven to be like.
Oh,
Because you're just looking down on the racetrack and you can see the whole thing. It's laid out and right in front of you. And I was fortunate enough to be there. I got there early enough to where I was able to cover several races from the old press box there in turn one.
oh wow.
And then that was a great seat. But then when when Bruton took over, SMI took over, and they built it into the Coliseum that it is today, the press box moved to the suite level between turns 3 and 4, and from that vantage point, it was literally almost like like you're looking down on top of everything. It's
Wow.
just such a beautiful view. But my other favorite tracks are not necessarily facilities,
Mhm.
but what restaurants were close by.
Ah, there you go.
Sambo's, in which is in Leipzig, Delaware, just a few miles outside Dover. Uh, Sambo's is famous for their seafood, their fresh seafood. It's right on the water. I don't know that they actually cast a net out the back door, but it tastes that fresh and it's that good. And it's just the atmosphere too, because 99% of the people who are there on a race weekend are racing people from the NASCAR garage. And so you may see Richard Petty and Dale Inman off in the corner, sitting by themselves with a stack of crab shells so high that they could barely see over it and look at each other. Bobby Labonte once asked me for $1 so he could put it in the jukebox. He still owes me that dollar to this day. And with interest, it now totals $37 million. Um, and just memories like that. That's cool. Then my other favorite restaurant on the Busch Series circuit was Rendezvous Ribs in Memphis.
Ooh, yeah.
It's a Memphis tradition. It's a Memphis staple. John Grisham has actually set scenes in several of his books in Rendezvous Ribs. And I'm not a rib person. I'm not a barbecue person necessarily. But one of my buddies in the sport, he wanted to go there, and so I went there and planned to just order a hamburger or whatever.
Mhm.
But the only thing on the menu is ribs.
Wow.
The only thing on the menu is ribs. I think they might have. I think they might have had barbecued chicken.
Mhm.
I don't think so. So that first time, I ordered half a rack, and then I ordered another half a rack, and then we came back the next night and I ordered a full rack.
There you go.
And so those are my memories of the Winston Cup circuit or the Busch Series circuit. And of course, back in those days, I was big on Chinese buffets,
Mm.
and me and Jason Keller could tell you where every Chinese buffet is in NASCAR. Yeah,
Wow.
in NASCAR. So
So, talk a little bit about, you mentioned leaving the scene and then going to work for NASCAR and the Busch Series side of things as a PR person. What was that transition like?
oh,
Oh
let's
dear.
see. What's the best way to put this? I found out very quickly that as a PR person, I really missed being a journalist.
Mm.
I honestly, I was not happy in that position.
Oh.
And when I was let go 11 months to the day after I started, my first reaction was to thank the guy who let me go because I just wasn't happy. I think I did a good job, but it's just not in my 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 world is pretty black and white.
Yeah.
It's either right or wrong, or you tell the story, and as a PR person, you have to kind of shade things and tell the story from a certain point of view. And I was not good. I was not comfortable doing that. And so, yeah, my first reaction was to thank the guy for letting me go.
Wow. So let's pivot now toward the project that you're currently working on and that you're even wearing the t-shirt for at the present time, the Scene Vault podcast. How did you and Steve sort of get this idea?
Well, first of all, you can see behind me, that is every Grand National, Winston Cup, NASCAR scene ever. From
Gosh.
the very first issue in April 1977 through the very last issue in December 2009.
Mm.
And there is no way to oversell how important this archive is. It is, for those 32 years, it was the best and most complete record of what happened in NASCAR, bar none.
Amen.
Period. End of sentence. And it ceased publication in 2009, and which was, I mean, it was a great loss, but I think it was time, because the internet had become
Yeah.
such a driving force in journalism, and so a hard copy newspaper or magazine, by what it had became at the very end, it was going the way of the dinosaur. But that being said, the awards that were won for stories written in this newspaper, the people who worked for that newspaper, the photographers who worked for that newspaper, they were the best of the best. Well, most of them were the best of the best. Most of them were the best. Okay, I
I
better not go.
sense I
Let's not
sense
go.
sto-
Let's
I
not
was
go
gonna
down that road.
I was gonna say I sense stories there, but I'm keeping my lips zipped.
Let's not go down that road. But in all seriousness, Deb Williams won the Catlin Award for that was basically the Pulitzer Prize for NASCAR journalism. She was the first woman to win it, to receive it. She was the first person to receive it 2 years in a row.
Wow.
And I don't even know how many Catlin Awards scene writers won or received. Writers of the Year from National Motorsports Press Association. The list of awards could just go on and on and on forever. But I say all that to say that if that coverage was that good, it deserves to be preserved and digitized. That I know of, this is the only complete archive in existence. I know that Western Carolina has an archive, and they have many issues bound. But I do know, I have been told that they are missing several issues.
Wow.
I don't even know that the parent company has a complete issue or a complete run. So this is the only in my knowledge, to my knowledge, it's the only one in existence. And the thing is, if something happened to this house, if a fire struck or a tornado struck or whatever, that would be gone,
Whew.
and that history would be lost.
That's a
And I'll
scary
tell you,
thought.
and I'll tell you how passionate I am about this project. I actually scanned the first 5.5 years of newspapers myself. I've scanned every cover. I've also scanned. I think I got through about mid to late 1982, and stopped scanning. And then after that, I've scanned a bunch of the more historic issues, like Dale Earnhardt's Daytona 500 win, Bill Elliott's Winston Million win, the 1992 Hooters 500, the first Brickyard 400. I've scanned a bunch of the historical issues after that. So there is no way that I could possibly ever completely scan all these myself. because the first 5.5 years of newspapers got me through the first half of the first shelf behind me.
God.
And I've got 2 complete bookcases full of newspapers.
Oh my God.
And so that just became an odyssey and trying to get the rights and so on and so forth. Well, in the process of doing all that, Steve and I started talking, and we eventually started talking about a podcast, basically as a way to make a little bit of money while I tried while I tried to scan all these newspapers. And so the podcast eventually took priority in the day-to-day workings of what we're trying to do. The preservation, the digitization, and the preservation of all these newspapers, that's always going to be my top priority. But I learned a couple of years ago that it's just simply out of my hands. That's way above my pay grade. And so it's going to take somebody way higher up the food chain to get it done. So in the meantime, I'm just going to concentrate on doing this podcast with Steve and producing the very best content that we possibly can, because I feel like what we're doing on the podcast continues the tradition of excellence that we built at the newspaper. We're continuing that on the podcast, and it's essentially a 2-man show. I do the majority of the work on the podcast. I edit and everything. We do have a sound guy who comes to most of the interviews now. And so things happen. I mean, like this week, we've got an interview with David Ift, and we did it at our studio at the NASCAR Technical Institute in Mooresville. And I happened to have Jason Keller's helmet that he had sent us, and it was sitting in the middle of the table. And so David actually leaned up and he was talking and he was gesturing. Well, when he was gesturing, he was knocking into the table.
Oh.
And it was making that helmet wobble on the table, and the microphone was picking some of that sound up.
Yeah.
And stuff like that drives me insane.
Oh God, me too.
Because our stories, I would put the content that we get, the interviews that we get, I would put that up against anybody in the business. Period. And I'm talking about the biggies and the networks and whatever. Yep. But because we're a smaller production crew, it's the technical stuff that just drives me crazy. So yeah, one of these days, we'll hit it, we'll strike it rich, and I'll be able to hire a full staff and produce all the bells and whistles and everything like that. So
that kind of ties into what myself and my director Renee Yaworsky is doing in building the network that this is on, Cosmos Creative TV. We're always, trying to find a sponsor, trying to find investors into this. And I know you and Steve have done the exact same thing as well. And I've had a lot of unique and sometimes disheartening challenges come up in the face of that, as have myself and Renee with growing Cosmos. How do you deal with those? I don't even really know how to word it. How do you deal with those challenges and shortfalls?
Through faith, and also, honestly and truly, our reviews and our comments on social media and on YouTube, 99.9% of them have been overwhelmingly positive. And there is, I'll get emotional talking about it. There is no way to fully describe what that means to me. Sometimes I feel very alone doing this podcast, because it's just me producing it and editing it and so on and so forth. But we have Patreon people who help us out. We get emails routinely. We get reviews on iTunes and so forth. And just as a for instance, we we had somebody email me it's been probably about a month ago now, and he said that he had just found the podcast 3 weeks before. And he's a long distance truck driver, so he's in his vehicle for hours on end. He said that he had found the podcast 3 weeks before, and in those 3 weeks he had listened to 197 episodes. I don't like the show that much. I mean, to listen to my voice for 197 episodes in 3 weeks, no, no, that just doesn't compute. But we continually have people telling us that they enjoy the interviews, they enjoy mine and Steve's interactions, and kind of giving each other a hard time, our relationship, and everything like that. And so it is the response from our listeners that keeps me going.
Amen.
If it wasn't for that, I don't know that I would have continued a couple of years ago. But they patted me on the back, they picked me up off the ground, they dusted me off, and they said, "You got to keep going because we enjoy what you're doing too much." So it would not be appropriate for me to give up. So I'm going to keep plugging along and providing the best content that we can.
Amen, brother.
Yeah.
I feel you in the core of my soul talk about, and I'm not saying this for a laugh or anything.
Oh
It's
yeah.
hard to do something like this. It's hard to be persistently just plugging along, and you have to deal with these people who say, "Oh, I had this hand in it," and they didn't even know who we were a month ago.
Yeah.
It didn't matter. It's a lot of frustration, but
Yeah.
man, there's a lot of grace and a lot of satisfaction in it when it does go right.
And the crazy thing to me is I'm a writer.
Mhm.
I am absolutely a writer. I am not a broadcaster.
Mm.
I have not gone to journal. I did not go to broadcasting school. I'm not necessarily an extreme introvert,
Mm.
but I am very definitely on that end of the spectrum. I am an introvert. I like my alone time, my quiet time.
Same here.
And when I get done doing an interview, I it's hard for me to talk the rest of the day. I mean, I know my sound guy, his name's Todd Phillips, and we will talk. He and I will chat all the way to the interview. But coming home from the interview, I tend to say very little. I tend to say very little because I guess I'm just trying to decompress from thinking ahead and talking. And it's actually kind of funny because I go to breakfast at a local place near here, a local diner, and the people who know me there, if they talk to me, I'll speak and we'll say hello and all that. But otherwise, I'll read my newspaper. I'll look at my phone. And one guy in particular, he said, "I listen to your podcast. You don't sound like the same person. You actually talk on the podcast." And then he dropped the ultimate bomb on me. He said that on the podcast I sound like a Yankee. What?
Oh no.
Nobody in the world. That's the first time anybody anywhere has ever accused me of sounding like a Yankee.
Oh
Now
my
I don't know
gosh.
where that was coming from, but that's just part of the process of learning to do this show.
So, a couple more things here, and then we'll sneak up towards the end of this. You mentioned the hard road that you took to get to Scene. We mentioned in the sound check some of the stuff that has gone on behind the scenes of in getting all the issues of Scene digitized, been a lot of heartbreak, a lot of disappointment. How did you keep your mental health and all in check? How did you not let the situations get to you?
That's a good question. That's a real good question. Um, uh, about that time, we were contacted. It was, yeah, it was pretty close together. We were contacted by Chris Powell at Las Vegas Motor Speedway. He is the president and general manager out there. He used to be the PR person for RJ Reynolds, and so I knew Chris back in the late '90s, but had not seen him in more than 20 years. But somebody had turned him on to the podcast, and he sent me an email that had to have been 5, 6, 700 words, telling me exactly what he loved about the podcast. And he asked me if we could talk on the phone. And this is the president at Las Vegas Motor Speedway. He's pretty high up the food chain.
Mm-hmm.
And so we talked, and during that conversation, he said, is sponsorship something that you would be interested in? Well, yeah. And so he offered us a presenting sponsorship for the podcast within maybe a month to 6 weeks after everything had happened with the whole digitization thing and everything. And that, again, it is the response from our listeners. Be it a long distance truck driver or a kid in high school or whoever, or the president of a racetrack, it's the response of our listeners that keeps me going. Absolutely, and without reservation, that's what keeps me going.
Yes. And the same with what we're doing here. It's just, as I said before, there's a lot of heartbreak, there's a lot of discord, there's a lot of just feeling low in doing this. But man, when the fans say that they love what you're doing and keep coming back time and time and time again, no matter how low you get,
Yeah.
it's a lifesaver.
Yeah.
It
It
really
is.
is a lifesaver.
Yeah.
So, one more question here that I'm going to split up into two different questions. What has been some of the best and worst interviews you have ever conducted? And what are some of the funniest moments that has ever transpired in an interview that you've conducted?
It is very hard for me, and that's actually a question I was asked last night. That my favorite interview. I can honestly say my favorite interview is the most recent one that we've done. Because if my favorite interview was released 2 years ago,
Mhm.
then why am I still doing this?
Good
I'm
point.
not I'm not gonna put out an interview that I don't consider to be uh, up to our standards. I've actually got 3 interviews that I have not used in 2 to 3 years.
Wow.
One one I would, well, actually 2 of them I would probably use at some point,
Mhm.
but it just hasn't, an opportunity just hasn't come up yet. There's one that I would not use, period, because it just was not a good interview. I didn't. I'll say this: I didn't agree with a lot of things that were said, and
Oh,
and just leave it like that. So, um, that was that. But my favorite interview. I mean, we interviewed Michael McSwain, And Michael McSwain is this really rough, gruff kind of bear of a guy, burly bear of a guy.
That back.
But when he looked at me and said that he had never gotten over getting out of racing, and he and I just, I mean, it was almost like we had forgotten that the recorder was on, and so we got kind of personal. And I told he told me his story. I told him my story about, you know, going sleeping at the racetrack and sneaking food out of the press box and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I told him about my son, about an incident with my son that completely and totally changed my life around. I told him about all that, and so that was just kind of of an instance that was kind of overwhelming. And then Steve and I did an interview last week that was the very first ever in 32 years I've been a journalist. I had tears streaming down both cheeks.
Wow.
It was that powerful.
Oh,
And so that's another thing that I enjoy about doing this podcast. We are more than just a NASCAR podcast. We talk about in a lot of cases we talk about life. Cliff Champion told us his story about trying to commit suicide. Lyndon Amick told us his story about being in combat in Afghanistan and the relationship with his wife, where he was unfaithful to her, and how they got all that turned around. And then this interview that Steve and I did last week, it's hard for me to even speak about it now because I just get choked up. So that's what we provide to our listeners, is the kind of content that you cannot get anywhere else.
and you're setting a great example, Rick.
Well, I'm trying to. I'm
Now,
trying to.
I will admit this right here. The Scene Vault is one of the major places where I have drawn inspiration for shows like this.
Mm-hmm.
I have, because I've listened to a lot of those deep, in-depth interviews that you and Steve have done, and I'm just like, man, if I can make the person I'm talking to that comfortable to the point where they can just tell the hard stuff, say the quiet parts out loud, I've really accomplished something.
Yeah. And in a lot of cases, we already know the person.
Mhm.
And so that working relationship is already pretty well down the road of being established. The David Ift interview that we did, of course, Steve and David have known each other for years and years. I had done a story on David in 1997, and I actually found it in the newspapers back here. And to my knowledge, that's the last time that he and I talked. So he and I did not have that relationship, but he and Steve did. And then I've just done enough interviews to where I can fairly quickly establish a relationship. So take that for what it's worth.
Rick, thank you for coming onto the show today. This was a wonderful interview, and just a real treat for me to get to interview someone that influenced me in terms of my interviewing.
Well, thank
It,
you. I
it,
appreciate that.
it has been a pleasure. And Rick, take care. Much love. And may God richly bless, my friend.